Good morning. It's good to be back at All Souls. As Nadine said, I grew up in this church. My parents were members here for 60 years. I got my Unitarian roots here. My family or relatives were hundreds of miles away or overseas, and so really my extended family was here. And there are many of you in the audience today, and thank you for coming. As I said, Joanne and I were members of the UU Fellowship in Topeka, Kansas for over 25 years, and we were involved in almost all aspects of that church at one time or another. But in the last couple of years, I became very involved with the fair trade, equal exchange sales in our church. And although we're a small fellowship of about 165 members, the sales of equal exchange products in our church, we rank in the top 5% of sales of all churches in the United States. And because of that, we were invited to participate in a fair trade delegation, interfaith delegation, that went to Nicaragua in February. And so that's really the basis of the talk today. And I'd like to thank John Murphy for the invitation to come today and give the message, and thank John and Jane for their warm hospitality, both to Joanne and me, and to our dog, Wilhelmina, as well. So thanks to them. So I've divided the message into kind of four parts. First of all, talk about the UUSC Coffee Project and their partnership with Equal Exchange. Secondly, to talk a little bit about some of the highlights of our experience in Nicaragua in February. Thirdly, to talk a little bit about coffee production. And so for those of you that are coffee lovers, hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about where your favorite drink comes from. If you're not a coffee lover, still listen, because there's a message there about fair trade and how those particular products are brought to market. And I will say that after the service, we have a table set up during coffee hour, so you can look at some of the products that we sold in Topeka, and be glad I will be there, and if you have any other questions or comments, be glad to interact with you there. And then finally, talk a little bit about a few reflections that Joanne and I had from our trip to Nicaragua, and go ahead and prod you a little bit with a call to action of things that you can do either individually or that All Souls can do as a congregation. So the UUSC Coffee Project was actually started in 2001 as a partnership between the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, UUSC, and Equal Exchange, which is a worker-owned cooperative based in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's part of a larger interfaith program that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And really, if you want more information about the Coffee Project, it certainly can be found on the UUSC website. What it says on the website, and really the core message today, is that it is a way, both individually and collectively as a congregation, for you to support your faith in the seventh principle. And John talked about the seven principles earlier. And it really says this, that the choices we make daily as individuals and as a congregation, as consumers of goods and services, affect thousands of people globally. So I'm going to repeat that because it's the core message this morning, that the choices you make, that I make, that we make as congregations of faith, those decisions we make daily about as consumers of goods and services affect thousands of people globally, and that's what we found when we went to Nicaragua. The UUSC, the most recent information, is really about sales in 2013. And in 2013, UU congregations bought over 77,000 pounds of fairly traded goods. And when you buy fairly traded goods through Equal Exchange, really your money counts twice, because for every pound of fairly traded products that is sold through UU congregations by Equal Exchange, they donate 20 cents per pound to the Small Farmer Project. So the Small Farmer Project is another part of UUSC, and again, if you want more information about that, it's on their website. But I'll just talk about one story from that. UUSC believes that supporting worker cooperatives is a good way to advance human rights. And so one of the stories on the website is about the Southern Alternatives Agricultural Co-op, which is a co-op in Georgia. It's solely owned and operated by African American women, and they basically produce and package and sell pecans. So the partner with UUSC and other denominations is Equal Exchange. Equal Exchange was founded in 1986. It's headquartered in a suburb of Boston. It is a worker-owned cooperative, has about 100 employee owners, and it is the oldest and largest fair trade coffee company in the United States. Fair trade, I found, is a very confusing topic. There's fair trade, there's free trade, there's NAFTA, there's CAFTA, there's direct trade, and it's very confusing. And one of the things I wanted to go on the trip is really find out. I've been working for Equal Exchange through our congregation for a couple of years, but I wanted to know, was this the correct organization to be working with? And fair trade is very confusing, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, where the large players like Nestle and Starbucks and those types of companies have talked about being in the fair trade business. And the really question is, what's authentic fair trade versus other forms of fair trade? So one way to look at it is to look for independent certification programs, and probably one of the most prominent is called Fair for Life. It's an organization based in Switzerland, and they describe themselves as a brand-neutral, independent, third-party certification program for social accountability and fair trade. And they're very transparent. You can go out for the Fair for Life website. You can see a list of all the companies and organizations that they have certified. You can see a list of all those companies and organizations that they have decertified. And you can look at all the criteria. And when they look at Equal Exchange as an independent third-party organization, they give Equal Exchange a 117% compliance rate, which means that for all the criteria they set up for fair trade criteria, certainly Equal Exchange meets or exceeds that. And that certainly makes me feel better. Equal Exchange itself has 5 primary things that drive their business. They want to pay a guaranteed minimum price to small farmers and cooperatives. And that's very important. Coffee, as an example that we'll use this morning, is a global commodity. It's just like oil, it's just like gold, it's just like any other commodity. There is a global commodity price. And Equal Exchange has said, we're going to pay a minimum price, and we will pay you a fair trade surplus or premium, and we will pay you an organic premium. They work only with democratically run farmer cooperatives, so primarily small farmer cooperatives, not large plantations. They provide pre-harvest credit, and that's very important, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. In Nicaragua, coffee is harvested in December and January and early February, and that's it. They get cash for that, and later in the year, that small farmer may need access, just like we might need a loan, access to other funds, and both Equal Exchange and the cooperative itself will do that. They develop long-term direct buying relationships, and we visited one of those co-ops that I'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, they encourage ecologically sustaining farming practices, primarily through promoting organic products. So if you think of an organic certification for Equal Exchange is done through USDA, which is a very formal process, and Oregon TILF. So let me tell you a little bit about coffee. Again, we're going to focus out on that today because we visited a small farmer or cooperative that produced coffee and a small farm that produced coffee. And between you and that small farmer, if you go through Equal Exchange or Fair Trade, it's about as direct sourcing as you can get. Because you have small farmers, and I'll describe the smart farmer that we lived with for 4 days. You have small farmers producing coffee. They're part of a larger cooperative. Equal Exchange has a relationship with that cooperative, so they have a business relationship. They buy the coffee. They buy green coffee beans, and I've got examples of those out at the table. They roast it, they blend it, and they send it to a congregation like this, and then it's sold directly to you. So there's only a couple of people between you and that small farmer that's produced that product. So the other good thing about Equal Exchange is they have a very active interfaith program. So it isn't just UUSC that they have a program with. They have programs with 11 other religious denominations. And so example, the American Friends Service Committee, the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America, Catholic Relief Services, Lutheran World Relief, Jewish Fair Trade Project are and UUSC are examples of 12 denominations that have this relationship with Equal Exchange. Interfaith sales are a very important part of Equal Exchange's business model. 22% of their sales are through congregations like this, 22%. Their largest single business partner is Trader Joe's. So if you've ever bought fairly traded organic coffee at Trader Joe's, it probably came from Equal Exchange. And I'll just read kind of the quote from Equal Exchange's website from their interfaith, because I think it really comes again to the heart of the matter today. The Equal Exchange Interfaith Program is a vibrant network of thousands of faith communities working to make a difference together by learning and promoting fair trade. People of faith are living out their values through their consumer choices, and farmer communities are providing for their families, greening our planet, and building a better future. So it's estimated there's somewhere around 55,000 religious congregations like this in the United States. Of those 55,000, 8,500 participate in the interfaith sales of fair trade products, so a very small percentage. Of those 8,500 congregations, 600 are UU. Okay, so we have the highest kind of participation rate of any denomination, and the top 5%, so those congregations that are in the top 5% of sales sell 29.5% of all the sales through interfaith. So if you look at that, that's almost 5 to 10% of all the sales of Equal Exchange fair trade products are through those top 5%. And so the other hidden message is, how would all souls like to get in that top 5%? So on to our Nicaragua experience. Because we joined a fair trade delegation. Again, it was made up of members of congregations that were in that top 5%. And we were an interesting group. There were 14 of us. 12 of us were from represented congregations. 2 were Equal Exchange employees. We ranged all the way from somebody from the eastern shore of Maryland to the state of Washington, from Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois and Virginia, and those of us in Kansas. And we represented Catholic, Methodist, Lutheran, Jewish, Congregational, and Joanne and I were the 2 UUs. So it was a very good interfaith experience. We were hosted in Nicaragua. We flew to Managua, which is of course, capital of Nicaragua, and we were hosted by an organization called CPAD. Now, Equal Exchange has a relationship with small farmer cooperatives, but they don't have a relationship that extends further in the country. CPAD was established, it is a Nicaraguan Council of Protestant Churches. It was established in 1972 after the earthquake that literally flattened Managua. And we saw Managua, we took a tour the first day, and there are parts of it that still haven't been rebuilt. So think about Indianapolis being completely flattened, and that's what they faced. And so CPAD started as a Christian NGO to really kind of coordinate disaster relief among Protestant churches in Nicaragua, and then ultimately from Protestant churches all around the world. We were very impressed. We stayed at what's called their Nehemiah Center, which is their guest center, and they host about 35 international groups a year like us. They come to Nicaragua for various purposes. We stayed in their guest center the first couple of days and the last couple of days that we were in Managua. They have a very aggressive community development program. So after they got through disaster relief in Managua, they started looking out within Nicaragua and said, how can we create sustainable, holistic change? So think of that, sustainable, holistic change. And so what they do on a 5-year cycle is they work with about 40, usually small rural communities, and they basically do community development in leadership training. So the hope is at the end of that 5 years, they've created change within that community that's sustainable. And so they focus on agricultural development, they focus on leadership training, they focus on education, very much focused on small communities, usually of around 500 to 1,500 people. They focus on food security, families, domestic violence intervention, because it's a problem there just like it is here. Very much focused on women's economic rights, and I'll talk about that again in a few minutes. And they are the organization that's been tabbed by the UN High Commission on Refugees to deal with refugees in Central America that are coming to Nicaragua. So the first couple of days we got an orientation, but the highlight was for the middle part of the week we went to the highlands, and the highlands is where the coffee is grown and where the cooperatives are located. And by the highlands we're talking about 1,000 meters, so about 3,000 feet is the best place for the coffee plants to grow. And we went to the Tierra Nueva Cooperative. Tierra Nueva was established in 1998. It is a democratically run small farmer cooperative. It's made up of 8 smaller farming cooperatives and represents about 600 families. Equal Exchange buys their coffee from 21 different similar cooperatives in 12 different countries throughout the world. So this was one of the cooperatives where they buy coffee. The larger Tierra Nueva Cooperative, those 600 families that are part of that cooperative, just like the story this morning of the turnip, it's very much a cooperative effort. So certainly we have families, and we have children, and they provide lots of services for that. Last year they exported around $2 million worth of products. They sold coffee to North America, organic coffee to North America and Europe, and they sell organic honey exclusively in 55-gallon drums to Germany. They're hoping to develop other export markets for jicama, for dried ginger, and for cocoa. So what does that larger cooperative do for that smaller family? They provide technical assistance. So if that farmer joins the cooperative and has never farmed organically before, they show them how that's done. They provide transportation. The farm we stayed on, the only way you could get there is by foot, by motorcycle, and you could get close with a 4-wheel drive vehicle. But a lot of times that commodity is making its first trip down the mountainside on a horse. And so having the infrastructure to transport, warehouse, and to market the product globally. And community development, so any profits that come back to the cooperative are used to help support those 600 families. And as an example, when we were there, they had just started a program where free dental care was being subsidized by the cooperative for those 600 families. I mentioned earlier about women's economic rights. We were very impressed that on the conference room wall were pictures of 2 groups of about 18 to 20 women that had gone through leadership training and development and then gone back to their smaller communities to do things like start schools. And in fact, Esmeralda, who was one of our hosts for our farm, was in charge of a $40,000 grant from Oxfam to give microloans exclusively to women. So we then went from the cooperative out to our homes to stay. The 14 of us were divided among 3 homes, and we stayed with Juan and Esmeralda Mora, and we just knew him as Don Juan. It was a very modest home. It was 3 rooms, dirt floor. It happened to be the home that Esmeralda grew up in and that she and Juan, after they were married, bought it from her parents. It was about 40 acres. We ate on the front porch with the dirt floor. They had running water, which was a hose coming down from the spring on the side of the mountain. And they had a separate wash house, a separate latrine. They had a separate dirt-floored kitchen. And we loved the chickens because the chickens ran in and out and everywhere. And we even wondered if we wanted chickens in our bedroom. And literally they had 3-room house, and they cleared out 1 room for the 6 of us to stay. And then they said that the chickens ate the scorpions. So we thought having the chickens around was a lot of fun. And it had public health significance as well. It was a sustainable farm. So it was about 40 acres, as I said. They had a milk cow, so we got raw, warm milk every morning. They had beef cattle on an adjacent property. They had pigs. They had chickens. They had a large garden. They had banana and citrus and other fruit trees, and that's what ended up on the table 3 meals a day. And they had cash crops, and they had coffee, so it was a small coffee farm, and honey. So one of the things we did in living on the farm is we got to go to work one day. So on Don Juan's property, We learned to dig yucca that ended up on our table. We got to plant coffee seeds. Again, the harvest had just completed, so we didn't get to harvest coffee, but we got to plant coffee seeds that would turn into seedlings, and we amended the soil and tried to get the soil ready for the seed to get the seedlings. And about now, they will be planting those seedlings that will begin harvesting coffee in about 2 to 3 years. Don Juan's farm and many others in Central America are affected with a disease called coffee leaf rust. It came to Central America in the 1980s. We saw them. They farm organically, and so we saw how they try to control that disease organically without using other chemical agents. So just a couple of comments about coffee production, and this is in memory of my father, whose bench is out here in the garden. Dad loved his family. He loved his church. He loved his profession, but I think he loved coffee the most. He was a chemist, and he had a sweatshirt that said caffeine and had the chemical structure for caffeine on the front of it. So Dad loved a good cup of coffee. So Dad, this is in sort of your honor. Coffee is kind of interesting. I've drunk it for a long time, but I really didn't understand where it came from. And here we are on a farm and visiting a cooperative to see the process. The name coffee comes from the genus of the species, Coffea, so C-O-F-F-E-A is the genus name. There are a number of different species. The highest quality is Coffea arabica, or Arabica coffee, and that's what's called shade-grown coffee, and that's the highest quality, and that's what we saw. We saw, and coffee is really a large shrub or a small tree, whichever way you want to look at it. It gets about 6 feet tall, and we saw it being grown in the shade. So coffee, we call them coffee beans. They aren't beans. They're the seeds of this flowering plant, and they produce a fruit that's red, and so they call them cherries. So it's a coffee cherry because it looks red like a cherry. And inside that are 2 seeds. Again, we call them beans, so you typically get 2 beans, which aren't a true bean, it's the seeds. You get 2 seeds out of each coffee cherry. And so locally on the small farm, they pick the coffee, they put it through a mill for wet processing. It takes off the rest of the fruit. It leaves behind 2 green coffee seeds, or again, we call them coffee beans. And I've got an example of green coffee beans that have been dried out on the table. From there, then it goes to the cooperative. So we have 600 families growing small amounts of coffee. It all goes to the cooperative, and we're able to visit the larger cooperative of which our host families were a member of. When it gets there, there are large drying areas called patios, so they spread it out in the sun. It's a part of Nicaragua that's very dry, out of the highlands, so it dries naturally, and when it achieves a certain level of moisture, then it goes to be processed. And we walked into a warehouse where literally there were thousands and thousands of 100-pound bags of coffee because they had just gotten done with harvest. And Equal Exchange buys about 1 container, so you think of container ships, they buy 1 container of coffee from this cooperative every year. So we saw them going through and processing coffee that was being sent not to Equal Exchange but to another fair trade organization. And I've got a bag out on the display table that is about 150 pounds, and that's how the beans are shipped. And for Equal Exchange, they get 1 container. That container goes on the road up to Honduras, gets on a ship that's already on the Atlantic side, so it doesn't have to go through the Panama Canal, and goes up to Boston. And then in Boston, they roast it and they blend it. And we saw several parts of the quality control cycle. And the first one was these thousands of beans, coffee seeds, are coming down a conveyor belt, and here are young women, about 12 of them, they're all volunteering, they're all part of the cooperative, are picking out extraneous material and picking out the beans that aren't high quality. And if you look at them, we looked at it and we couldn't tell the difference, but you would look at one and it had a little insect hole in it, or it was somehow damaged. And later we asked the chief executive officer of the cooperative, where did those second-rate beans go? And he just smiled and he said, Nestle and Starbucks. So I can tell you from looking at the process is the best quality beans come here. We then watched a process called coffee cupping. It's part of the quality control. I'd never really heard the term before, A young woman who is a sensory scientist, they take a certain amount of coffee, they lightly roast it, they grind it immediately, they mix it with a certain amount of water at a certain temperature, and then they go through a whole sensory profile. She smells it, she gets the grounds to the bottom, she smells it again, she's taking notes when we got to go through this process, and it's called coffee cupping. And so before a container ever goes to an organization or a company, they do coffee cupping, and it has to pass their quality control. Equal Exchange, when they get those green beans in a container from Tierra Nueva, they immediately do the same thing. So as soon as it comes off the ship, they take aliquots and they do coffee cupping, and it has to meet their quality control standards. And after they roast it and blend it before it's ever sent out to you, they do another coffee cupping. And so a couple of the coffee, there isn't, Equal Exchange doesn't make a coffee that's exclusively Nicaraguan beans, but there are a couple of coffees that I have on the table. One's French Roast and one's called Love Buzz, and they find that the Nicaraguan beans are best in those blends. And I'm really excited that hopefully in 3 or 4 years, I'll buy one of those and I'll be drinking coffee from a plant that I stuck in the ground, or at least I put the seed in the ground. One final comment about our visit. We were there the week of Ash Wednesday. And so on Wednesday afternoon, they set up for us to visit a Catholic church. It was a small, simple building. We got there, and there's one priest that is responsible for about 10 different congregations. And so we listened to the service in Spanish. The priest kept talking about Papa, and I figured that was the Pope. That's about the only part that I understood. But we were welcome there, and it was a wonderful experience to go through that ritual with a Catholic congregation on Ash Wednesday. And what Joanne and I noted is that we and maybe 2 other small groups were the only people that arrived by car. Everybody else was walking to church, rode a horse, and when they were walking or riding the horse, they were in their Sunday best. And they had been walking for hours to get to church. Now, certainly it was a holy day, it was a special day, but sometimes I get up on Sunday morning and I wonder, do I go to church this morning or not? And I think now that it's a pretty easy decision for me versus looking at these other individuals. And we also were able to attend an evangelical service that same afternoon. So what are some final kind of reflections? And we had many from our visit. I certainly went to learn about fair trade. I went to learn about equal exchange. I went to Nicaragua to see the country, but as in most cases, it turned out to be the people and the human interactions that were the most important. We were part of an interfaith delegation. We came from many different states, many different denominations, but we had a lot in common. We learned from each other. We worked together. We played together. And that was really important. And certainly the same is true for the people on the small farms and the farmer cooperatives. If we think about the term radical hospitality, it only takes a little to give a lot. By our standards, these farmers had nothing. They lived in a dirt floor, in small houses, and yet they gave everything. They housed us, they fed us, they entertained us, they taught us, they allowed us to work beside them. And when I recounted that to our minister back in Topeka, she says, well, you know, Phil, when you eat together, you work together, you dance together, you talk together, and you pray together, lots of good things can happen. And I think that's certainly what we found. Well, also, it kind of changed my view of entrepreneurship. We hear a lot about entrepreneurship from the business community. We hear a lot about it from our universities. Everybody talks about it. And yet again, I saw these people really were the true embodiment of entrepreneurship. It's not sitting in Silicon Valley. It's not a new startup company here. They really embodied, to me, entrepreneurship. They had enough electricity, Juan and Esmeralda did, to run one light bulb in 3 different rooms, a small boombox, and a small TV. And they'd only had that for a couple of years. And yet, Don Juan in the evening could sit there with his son's smartphone, and he knew what the commodity price of coffee was on the world market. And here was Esmeralda, who was able to go through leadership training through the co-op, and she was in charge of that $40,000 grant from Oxfam, and they were using that money and turning it over and using it for microloans exclusively for women's initiatives. And I thought, that's true entrepreneurship, and I think it'd be interesting to get people in business schools here and in businesses here to really look at that and say, again, you don't have to have a lot, or you can have a little and still do a lot. So kind of in closing, remember the turnip story. It's all about cooperation, and certainly that's what we saw about both within our families. We lived in a household that had 3 generations living in the household, and the way they cooperated and lived together. We saw that in the other cooperative. This is titled Brewing Justice. And again, let me go back to that 7th principle. As a people of faith, we need to live out our values through our consumer choices, and the choices we make daily affect thousands of lives. So my call to action to you is think about individually the choices you make as a consumer in this country, in this society. It really does affect thousands of lives everywhere. And so what are those choices you make? And then collectively, I think the opportunity for all souls is to get involved beyond individually. What can you do as a congregation to promote these concepts, the concepts of fair trade? And so that's my message. I'll be out at the table. Be glad there are pictures there of our stay, examples of the fair trade products that could potentially be sold in the congregation. And if there's individuals or groups that would like my help in getting it jump-started, that's why I'm here. Thank you.